Giulia Carbone, diesen Namen müssen Sie sich wirklich auf der Zunge zergehen lassen. Also Giulia Carbone bei diesem Thema, wo es um CO2-Ausstoß geht, ist stellvertretende Leiterin des Global Business und Biodiversity-Programmes der Internationalen Union für Conservation of Nature. Die Weltnaturschutzunion erstellt unter anderem die rote Liste gefährdeter Arten zusammen und kategorisiert Schutzgebiete. Giulia Carbone ist Mitautorin eines gerade erschienenen Leitfadens der Kriterien für den naturverträglichen Ausbau von Windenergie und Photovoltaik festlegt. Jetzt hören Sie Giulia Carbone.
Ladies and gentlemen, it's a real honor to be here with you today for KNE 2021 Congress on Climate, Energy and Nature. I'm Giulia Carbone, Deputy Director at the Global Business and Biodiversity Program at IUCN, the International Union for Conservation of Nature. IUCN is a democratic union that brings together the world's most influential organizations and top experts in a combined effort to conserve nature and accelerate the transition to sustainable development. Our key numbers are 1,400 members, 18,000 experts in 6 global commissions, and we are active in 160 countries. I know we would all wish we were there in person, but I think the fact that we are still together, even if virtually, it's a testament to the commitment of all our organizations to address the 2 main crises that our planet is facing today, the climate and biodiversity crisis, which are also fueling each other. Energy growth is directly linked to the well-being and prosperity across the globe. Meeting the growing demand for energy in a safe and environmental responsible manner is a key challenge. But today, energy is by far the largest source of greenhouse gas emissions from human activities. The use of fossil fuels for heating, electricity, and transport and industry contributes 90% of global greenhouse gas emissions. Renewable sources must play a critical role in reversing this, combined with measures to enhance energy efficiency as a way to limit total energy demand. However, modern renewables were only 11% of the total final energy consumption in 2019, only a slight increase compared to a decade ago. The share of fossil fuels between 2009 and 2019 has remained constant at 80%. There are pockets of good news. The share of renewables for power generation jumped to 29% in 2020, up from 27% in 2018. But we need to do much, much more. According to the recent International Energy Agency report, to reach net zero emissions by 2050, annual clean energy investment worldwide will need to more than triple by 2030 to around $4 trillion. These investments have to be made, though, in a way that they will not impact biodiversity, as biodiversity loss has already reached unprecedented rates, with 3/4 of land surface now severely altered by human activity and 1 million species threatened by extinction. And let's not forget that these 2 crises are deeply interlinked. Climate change is a significant driver of biodiversity loss, and the loss of biodiversity exacerbates the climate crisis. The potential impacts on biodiversity, ecosystem services, and nature-dependent livelihoods need to be anticipated and addressed, not only to safeguard nature, but also to avoid obstacles, roadblocks, and delays to the transition itself. All sources of renewable energy can contribute to the loss of biodiversity and the disruption of ecosystem services, with potentially the risk of contributing to the degradation of the areas important for the conservation of nature at global and local level. Habitat disturbance, degradation and loss, pollution, the introduction of invasive species are among the most predominant drivers for biodiversity loss associated to renewable energy developments. For certain sources, the impact will be concentrated around the projects. For others, such as hydropower plants, the impacts will be experienced at the entire watershed level. In addition, according to a 2020 World Bank report, production of minerals such as graphite, lithium, and cobalt could increase by nearly 500% by 2050 to meet the growing demand for clean energy technologies. The report estimates that over 3 billion tons of minerals and metals will be needed to deploy wind, solar, and geothermal power, as well as energy storage requiring for achieving a below 2 degrees future. We therefore need to find ways to addressing climate change and biodiversity crisis in a mutually supportive way. A transition to renewable energy, which both avoids harms and contributes to nature conservation, can only happen with the support of all relevant decision makers at every stage, from planning to implementation. Governments need to ensure risks on nature are identified as early as possible and take action to mitigate them, such as protecting undisturbed areas from developments. Financial institutions can attach similar safeguards to loans and investments, and energy companies should avoid, minimize, restore, and then offset the residual impact on biodiversity throughout the life cycle of the project. If we are to achieve a net zero emission through renewable energy sources, we also need new technologies to make energy consumption more efficient and to integrate circular economy principles. Most risk can be avoided through early planning to ensure that wind and solar projects are placed in areas of low biodiversity. Wider public policies and plans, such as spatial planning and strategic impact assessments, are necessary to help identify areas where developments will not come to an unacceptable cost to nature. This will include identification of go areas, that is, areas that are already converted and disturbed, therefore effectively prioritizing development of areas of low biodiversity. Utility-scale wind and solar developments incompatible with the objective of the conservation outcome of protected or conserved areas should be avoided. Energy companies should implement in full the mitigation hierarchy. Its rigorous application is vital for the identification and for the management of potential impacts on biodiversity. Focus on early avoidance is key for delivering not net loss or net gain targets for biodiversity. Numerous measures exist, including the use of technology, for example, that can temporarily shut down turbines to protect birds and other species of concern at particular times or when they are detected in the vicinity. Restoration and offset should be considered only as a last resort. In certain situations, solar and wind projects can even create opportunities for biodiversity enhancement. This is where nature-based solutions could be part of your solution. To ensure people are not negatively impacted by solar and wind expansion, developers need to account for potential social impacts, including those that might arise from biodiversity mitigation measures, particularly when implementing offsets. And businesses should also pay more attention to upstream impacts, and in particular those associated to the sourcing of the raw materials used for manufacturing of solar and wind components. End-of-life decisions are also critical, given the amount of structures that will need to be disposed of. Financiers have a huge responsibility as well, not only to finance this massive transition, but also to ensure that this finance is directed to projects that have demonstrated that they can adhere to best practices and avoid and minimize impacts on nature and people. Early risk screening approaches are available and are supported by numerous global data sets. IUCN has been very active in this field. Since 2019, we have partnered with Électricité de France, Energia de Portugal, and Shell Group to promote the application of the mitigation hierarchy and best available measures to reduce biodiversity impacts associated with renewable energy, in particular solar and wind projects. This collaboration has been supported by the Biodiversity Consultancy, BirdLife International, Fauna Flora International, and the Wildlife Conservation Society, all IUCN members. The IUCN TBC guidelines, entitled Mitigating Biodiversity Impacts Associated with Solar and Wind Energy Development, support all actors to understand and manage the biodiversity risk associated with solar and wind projects across the entire project's life cycle by highlighting practical and science-based best practices and providing globally representative examples. We have 33 of them. At the end of the month, we will launch a series of interpretation guides to support the use of biodiversity data in early risk screening. We are currently designing a new 2-year program of work, and we would welcome additional energy companies interested in elaborating testing and promoting best practices for managing the impacts on biodiversity. So let me conclude with a few messages. We are now moving into a new era, the era of renewable energy. We have to move to this era, the era of low carbon and even net zero carbon emissions, where the majority of energy consumed will be generated through renewable sources, and we need to celebrate this. But we also need to ensure that there is a firm commitment to integrate proper safeguards from the outset to ensure that nature and people will not be affected by the negative consequences of this transition. The transition to a new energy paradigm must be both carbon neutral and nature positive. Thank you very much for the invitation again, and I wish you a successful meeting.